Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of the Muslim Education Show. Today is a very special show. আমাদের সাথে এসেছেন Rafiqul Haq and Mehdi Ahmed. Rafiqul Haq উনি অনেক বছর আর অনেকবার বলকানসকে ভিজিট করেছেন, and Mehdi Ahmeder একটা পডকাস্ট আছে, আর এই পডকাস্টের নাম হচ্ছে ফরগটেন হিস্ট্রি। তো আমাদের মেইন ইন্টারেস্ট আজকে হচ্ছে ডিসকাশন হবে বসনিয়াতে কি হয়েছে, আর এটা আমাদের জন্য ঘরে কেন ইন্টারেস্টিং, যে আজকে আমরা এখানে যে লন্ডনে বসে আছি, এখান থেকে যে বসনিয়া কি হয়েছে কি না হয়েছে এটা আমাদের কনভারসেশনে আলোচনা হবে। প্রথমে আমি শুরু করব রফিকুল ভাইয়ের সাথে, যে আপনি একটুখানি আমাদেরকে বলেন যে আপনি যে বাংলাদেশি কিন্তু এই বসনিয়ান ইন্টারেস্ট আপনার কিভাবে আসলো?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters who joined the show. My interest in visiting Bosnia really started on the basis that I wanted to visit some Islamic countries to learn about the history in those particular countries. But particularly Bosnia, the reason why the interesting story for me was I went to Umrah just over a couple of years ago. And it was literally 10 minutes conversation that I had with a brother during that period. Once on the airport, in the airport, and then basically in Mecca when we met briefly and we exchanged numbers. So I contacted him when I came back and I said I was going to visit Bosnia. So that's how I developed my relationship with this brother called Adis. But I really wanted to see Bosnia because of it's a Muslim country, and obviously the history behind it in terms of what happened back in the 1995 with the massacre.
MashaAllah. So I think there might be a similar connection for you, Mehdi, that you also kind of went out there. Is it similar to Rafiqul Bhai that kind of garnered your interest?
I think, first of all, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. With Bosnia, I visited with my family, of course, and we visited because our hearts were connected with Bosnia. Like, for example, my father, he done a lot of work with for Bosnia, like in terms of funding during the wars, helping the Bosnians who were obviously getting massacred. But our hearts were connected with Bosnia because I visited when I was very young, when I was 2 years old. Because
what made you go at such a young age?
One of our dear friends who was Bosnian was getting married. So we visited at a very young age. And then when I was older, when I was about 13, in 2018 I visited again. And this is when I developed a full interest in history. It was actually my trip to Bosnia which developed my interest in history, because I visited, there was one well that was designed by Suleiman the Magnificent in Bosnia. And when I saw that, it was still flowing. That's when I started getting interested into Ottoman architecture. And seeing that it was still preserved in Bosnia, which had been a place pillaged by war, and still a masjid and a well was still standing. That was a very moving experience for me in terms of developing an interest for history. And obviously visiting a Muslim country at the heart of Europe, it's one of the centers of Europe, in the Balkans, and it's completely a Muslim region. You see it, it's like European, but it's also it's a Muslim area.
Wow, so I've never been, so this is fascinating for me. আমি কিন্তু কোনো সময় বসনিয়াতে যে ভিজিট করি না, আমি জানি না যে আপনারা ঘরে যে আপনারা যারা শো দেখছেন আজকে, আপনারা কি ভিজিট করেছেন নাকি বসনিয়াতে, আর যদি আপনারা ভিজিট করেছেন তাহলে আমাদেরকে ফোন করেন আর আমাদেরকে একটুখানি আপনাদের এক্সপিরিয়েন্সও বলেন। It's really interesting actually for me to hear that you had this quite emotive experience, that you saw this architecture and you connected it, being a British Muslim yourself, that to kind of connect how it connects yourself to Islam, to the Ottomans. Is there আপনার কি কোনো similar experiences when you were there? Did you see anything that made you kind of, that hit you personally?
I think when you go to Bosnia and when you go to Istanbul, obviously there's a linkage with the Ottoman Empire, and the architecture is so similar. The masjids, they are amazing, in terms of its presentation. And the country itself is beautiful. I mean,
Bosnia
as a country, I mean, it's a beautiful country.
Like more natural or more for kind of tourism?
I think both sides. I mean, for me, it was naturally beautiful. So when you go to Mostar and the various locations near Mostar. There's a lot of history there. The sceneries are beautiful. It's a Muslim country, as this brother has said. And the best thing about that is wherever you go, most of the places you want to eat at is halal.
Okay, so you get halal food
Yes. And the other thing I would say is really when people look at sort of visiting different countries in terms of financial feasibility, it's a very sort of cheap location to visit. The food, accommodation, flights, etc., all of those things.
তো আপনারা যদি প্ল্যান করছেন যে বসনিয়াতে ট্রাভেল করার জন্য, আপনারা যদি এই সামারে কোনো হলিডে জায়গা যদি প্ল্যান করছেন, তাহলে যেটা রফিকুল ভাই আমাদেরকে বলে দিচ্ছে যে একটা পুরো ফ্যামিলির সাথে ওখানে যাওয়া যায়, অ্যান্ড খাওয়া দাওয়ারও রিজনেবল, আর ওটার উপরে এখানে পুরো একটা মুসলিম এনভায়রনমেন্ট পাও। In Bosnia at the moment, is it still quite a practicing environment? Are you there? Like, so there are parts of Europe, I imagine, where there is a large Muslim presence, but you don't have practicing Muslims. Do you have quite a practicing environment? Is there adhan?
100%. It's very much like when you go to Istanbul and you think of the adhan illuminating the city. I just came back from Istanbul a week
mashallah,
ago.
okay.
So you think of the adhan illuminating the city. It's exactly the same in Bosnia. The adhan, it depends on where you are, right? Because certain cities are Christian majority, but most cities are Muslim majority. And the adhan illuminates the entire city.
Wow.
There's people going, masjids are full. You think of, in today's society, even when you go to like Istanbul or other places, not all the masjids are completely full because there's so many. But in Bosnia, when we were going to the masjids, I saw it completely full. And it's a very welcoming country. I feel like the people are very, very welcoming. They see a person who's a tourist, they see them as their guest. They welcome them into their homes. They feed them. It's very.
Wait, hold on. How many homes did you go into to eat?
It looks like a lot of homes.
Alhamdulillah, we managed to visit because we were with a brother from Bosnia, so he was taking us around, and we visited many homes with fellow travellers as well. And there was other people who we met there who invited us into them. Even veterans. One veteran invited us into his home. And we ate there, and it's very much of a welcoming country. They have that sort of hospitality, that Islamic hospitality that you want when you go to a Muslim country, that you're feeling welcomed. And that's what you get in Bosnia.
MashaAllah. And did you experience the same? Did you manage, because you went there on a kind of personal invite, so you had that kind of, I imagine that you got to meet a lot of the locals, because sometimes when we go as tourists, we see things through tourist eyes, but you got to see more localized. Did you get to experience the same? Or?
I think there's two things I will say. One is obviously the welcomeness in terms of invitations, stuff like that. So when I went, I met up with that. First time when I went for a very brief period. So I met up with this brother, and we developed a connection. So again, he visited the UK a few months ago, and we sort of met up, and I've hosted him at my home. And again, when we were talking recently, he sort of invited me and my family to go over and stay. So this is a very important point that this brother has said. I mean, the emphasis, especially to the audience that I will give, it's just amazing the sort of Islamic brotherhood that we develop. And I emphasize that point because, as I started off by saying, when we went to Bosnia, the reason that I was more attracted was because I met that brother at Hajj, and I connected with him afterwards, and I felt that I needed to go. And I've never known him before. It was a 10-minute sort of conversation. Wow. And amazingly, we've now developed a friendship. And I've learned a lot about, a couple of things I would also say is, in terms of the sort of religious identity or practicing element of it, Bosnian Muslims weren't practicing. I mean, the feedback I've had from my brother is they weren't practicing before the war. Almost 95%, he said, when I spoke to him, weren't really practicing Muslims, keeping fast or things like that. But the war itself, the genocide, completely changed all of that. I think it brought people back to Islam. And there is more and more people in Bosnia who are connected. So when you go to the new city in Sarajevo, basically there is a masjid which has been sort of funded by Saudi Arabia, King Fahd Masjid. And when you go in that location, I'm not sure whether that brother has visited, but you can see the presence of Muslims now.
MashaAllah.
Whereas that wasn't necessarily the case 20, 30 years ago or prior to that. So it was tragic in terms of what's happened, but it has brought people back to Islam in a very strong way. And I think that's quite important for us to sort of highlight, so that as Muslims, not just people living in Bosnia, but across the globe, we can relate to what's happened and how things have changed.
No, thank you. It's শুনে একটুখানি খারাপ লাগে, কিন্তু রফিকুল ভাই যেটা বলছেন যে বসনিয়াতে যে ওয়ারটা হয়েছিল ওইটার আগে কিন্তু 95% অফ মুসলমান যারা বসনিয়াতে ছিল ওরা কিন্তু নামাজ রোজা করতেন না। আর ওই ওয়ারটার ভিতরে কিন্তু ওরা একদম মুসলমানদের পিছনেই ওরা ছিল। আর এখানে একটা কম্প্যারিজন করা যায়, ইফ আই এম নট রং, দ্যাট যেরকম জিউসদেরকে হলোকস্ট হয়েছিল, একটা সিমিলার সিচুয়েশন হয়েছে ফর দ্য বসনিয়ান মুসলিমস। অ্যান্ড যেরকম Adolf Hitler went after the Jewish community, এই জন্য যে ওরা জিউস ছিল, এটা সেম সিচুয়েশন হয়েছিল কিন্তু বসনিয়াতে যে মুসলমানদের সাথে। আর ওই যুদ্ধর পরে কিন্তু এখন আমরা দেখি যে ওই পুরা দেশটা কিন্তু ট্রান্সফর্ম হয়ে গেছে। মেহেদি ভাই, আপনি একটুখানি আমাদেরকে একটুখানি খুলে একটুখানি ওই যুদ্ধর ভিতরে কি হয়েছে বলতে পারবেন?
Of course. If we look at the history of how Islam entered Bosnia, it was of course the Ottoman conquest in 1463 by Sultan Mehmed II. And Bosnia was one of the only regions, as well as Albania and Kosovo, that gradually became Muslim over time. Because if you look at the other areas in the Balkans that the Ottomans controlled the whole Balkans, right? They had Romania, Bulgaria, even Hungary at some point. They had a huge part of the Balkans, but not many of them. You don't see a strong Islamic community in those countries today. However, in Bosnia, it's very interesting that there's a huge that gradually over time Islam grew exponentially to the point where it was even the majority even during the Ottoman period. And the Ottomans, through the Balkans, they collected many janissaries. So the janissaries were the people who represented the army, and the janissaries, those who weren't in the army, would be taken as part of members of state, for example, members of parliament or whatever, during the Ottoman rule. And that's why Bosnia, over time, they started developing madrasas, and from that you start getting Islamic education in Bosnia, and more people became Muslim during that period. This, unfortunately, did not stay the case because of the Austro-Hungarian rule. The Ottomans lost Bosnia during the Austro-Hungarian rule, I believe in the late 19th century. And then the Austro-Hungarians, to keep the Muslims happy, they established the Islamic community of Bosnia, and from there they managed to keep the Muslims there. But when Yugoslavia happened and World War I happened, there was a sudden rise in communism. Islam slowly started to lose its place, because in a communist state, where is Islam going to function in Bosnia? And that's why I think the brother's saying a lot of people were not practicing. However, even with this, with certain leaders like we have Izetbegovic, Begovic, who was the president of Bosnia during the 90s, you started seeing a rise of Islam. You started seeing a beginning of more madrasas just before the war. And as the war took off, there was chaos everywhere. They could not establish a successful Islamic educational system during the war, because there was so much chaos, people being massacred here, there and everywhere. It was not the right environment to establish that. That after the war, because so many people had been, as my brother here said, because so many people had been massacred, people wanted to come back to Islam. And with that, it's also the fact that Muslims were now having that identity, that I'm a Muslim. My ancestors have been killed. My father, my grandfather, my brother, they've been killed. So I need to be focused on my Muslim identity. And from that, more people started identifying as Muslim.
Okay.
And from that, I started identifying as a strong Muslim. And because you also started getting the help from the places like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, the Islamic help, people sending Muslims in to help Bosnia, those people began talking to others, started talking to the locals. They started getting the more practicing Muslims as well. So from the war, you can see just before the war there was a beginning in a spike of Islam because of President Izetbegovic and his more Islamic reforms. And then you had, after the war, a more rise of Islam. But because of the communist period, people forget that communism ruled Bosnia for a large period, and that's why you had a sort of fall in the practicing of Islam. People knew the basics, but people started losing that sort of outward goingness of Islam.
And আপনারা যখন বসনিয়াতে ভিজিট করেছেন আপনারা কি কোনো মাদ্রাসাতে গেছেন? Like, did you visit any of the madrasas directly yourselves?
I visited many masjids, and we went and saw one madrasa where the children were studying. I can't remember the name exactly. I think it was in Sarajevo, but where the children were studying, and I think there was 130 students, young boys studying in the madrasa, learning the Quran, learning the fiqh, learning.
And the madrasas there, are they similar to what we would find in Bangladesh or in London today?
I think you would make it more similar to Turkey, because obviously you have the Ottoman rule. There's many similarities in just the design of Bosnia's masjids, the design of the madrasas. They all came from the same route. If you look at when the huge Turkish sort of madrasas started happening, was even in the Seljuk period with Nizam al-Mulk establishing the Nizamiya madrasas, which taught the fundamentals and basics of Islam because of the rise of many different sects within Islam. That core was central to the Ottoman rule in terms of their madrasas. It's still central in Turkey and is in Bosnia as well.
Okay, so what's the text that they're kind of learning from?
What do you mean by that?
So, for example, in Turkey, is there like set texts that they will read from? Like, I guess in the UK, you're in Darul Ummah. Is there set texts that the students learn that they have to go through, as part of their Alamiya program? Is there set text?
Yeah, they'll have the curriculum,
Right.
so that they start from A to Z and develop in that respect. So yeah, I mean, I have to say I haven't visited the madrasa. So when I visited, it was mainly the masjids. So they will have set texts. I mean, the center that I spoke to my brother about from Bosnia, he was saying the King Fahd Masjid have also developed a cultural center next door, and basically what they do is they offer education, free education. So it would include the Arabic teachings, it would include IT, sciences, and so on.
Right.
So all of that is provided free. And it's not just this, Saudi Arabia, but there is other countries like Qatar, Malaysia, and so on, who are also sort of engaged in Turkey as well, in supporting, in developing the Islamic institutions in the country. And he also mentioned to me and gave a sort of figure, obviously, it was said roughly about 70 mosques maybe before the war, but since the war there's roughly about 300. So the number of institutions and madrasas and mosques within Sarajevo has increased quite a bit since the war. So that sort of establishes the sort of the fact that people are getting more connected to Islam because of what's happened, and obviously become more involved in their deen.
I mean, I imagine as a country, it's a huge wake-up call. I mean, I can't imagine what bigger wake-up call can you have as a nation than genocide.
Yeah.
Like, and even for the Bosnians that are coming out of these institutions today, as you quite rightly said, they will all have members of their family that were killed, tortured, raped as part of their history. Now, what kind of impact does that have on a people to know that someone in my family had this done to them? What does that affect people? How? Because we've seen in the school systems in the UK, when we've seen children that have come from civil war, they have an impact. War has a devastating effect on the psychology of a human being. And we see that with Rwanda, we've seen that with Somalia, we've seen that with many different students when they've come to the UK and they're in the education system, the effects of that. More recently, Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, as both of you have kind of visited and been out there, how have you seen the people respond? What kind of differences do you see with the Bosnian community that you don't see with the UK British community in terms of their people? Because আমরা কিন্তু মানে হতে পারে আমরা আমাদের ভিউয়ারের ভিতরে কেউ কেউ আছে যারা বাংলাদেশ লিবারেশন ওয়ারের ভিতরে এক্সপিরিয়েন্স করেছেন, আর আপনারা খুব ভালো করে জানবেন যে ওয়ার কীভাবে একটা মানুষকে অ্যাফেক্ট করে। এই জন্য আপনাদের মা বাপ ওর আপনারা নিজেও হতে পারে আপনারা এক্সপিরিয়েন্স করেছেন, কিন্তু এখানে বসনিয়ার কিন্তু সেম জিনিস হয়েছে, আর ওই বসনিয়ান কমিউনিটির কিন্তু এটা খুব কাছে। আমাদের এটা হয়েছে 1971-এ, বাট দিস হ্যাপেন্ড ইন 1995. That means that the children from that war are now in their
30s, yeah.
Right. So it's real. It's very real for a very young community. And have you spoken to people how it's affected them? Do you see the differences?
Can I just, on that particular point, brother, the tragic thing is this brother that I have developed a connection with, tragically, and it's not just 1995, it was when the massacre really took place.
1990s.
Yeah, and it sort of almost 9,000 people massacred.
Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, now, and that's what's been, remembered every single year, which is really important. But it happened before then. This brother I'm talking about, around about 1990 to 93, he personally suffered great loss. His mum was murdered. His grandparents were murdered. His father and uncle went to war to defend them and died in that war. So going back to your question, what you mentioned earlier, you can just imagine almost a generation was killed, not because of any other reason, but because they were Muslims. Yeah.
Sorry, Mehdi, did you want
To touch on that point, is that a common theme is when you're looking at events in history, is that you look at everyone as numbers. You look at people as, okay, 9,000 people, or 10,000 people, or 100,000 people, 1 million people. You just see them as numbers. But if you look at the individual stories of just how, for example, the brother that you were talking about, having lost his entire family in a country which has just come out of one of its biggest wars in its history, a country which is struggling economically, which does not have the economy to get out of such a war, how would he be feeling? Or if you look at other stories, for example, when I visited Srebrenica, which we visited, we watched a video that the Serbian soldiers had filmed, is that there was a group of, I think, 10 boys, no older than 18 to 19. They killed every single one of them, and by each person they killed, they got his friend to bury him. Then they killed him. So they killed 9 friends, they got one boy to bury every single friend, and then they killed him. If you just look at the individual stories, it's obviously when you think of it on an individual scale, then you just times that by however many people are suffering that. Every single person in Bosnia has suffered that. If you over the age of 30, they have suffered some sort of persecution in that sense. And as the brother said, it's because they were Muslim. The people don't realize that the Serbians, they got Muslims to wear a certain, just like the Nazis got the Jewish people to, I don't know what they wore a certain sign on their arms.
Star of David, was it?
I think it was the Star of David. They wore it on their arms. They knew their businesses. They knew exactly where they lived. If they were hiding a Jew in a certain attic, they would know.
Right.
Similarly, the Serbians got the Muslims to wear certain, I couldn't remember which, certain cloth that separates them from the Christian Bosnians, or that separates them from the Serbians, so they know who to kill.
যেটা মেহেদি ভাই বলছেন এখানে যে the similarities between what happened with the Jews and the Bosnians is uncanny. And inshallah, আমাদের ব্রেকের পরে we'll discuss this in more detail inshallah. আপনারা থাকেন আর ব্রেকের পরে আমাদের সাথে আবার engage করেন inshallah. জাযাকাল্লাহ খাইর। আসসালামু আলাইকুম ওয়া রাহমাতুল্লাহ। Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back. আজকে আমাদের guests আমাদের সাথে আছে Rafiqul Bhai and Mehdi Bhai. Mehdi Bhai has a podcast called Forgotten Histories, and Rafiqul Bhai has for several years visited across the Balkans. আর আমাদের main discussion আজকে হচ্ছে about Bosnia. and for this part আমরা যেটা ডিসকাস করব যে একটা ছোট একটা ক্লিপ দেখবেন আর ওটার পরে আমাদের ডিসকাশন হবে যে বসনিয়ার যেটা হয়েছে, যে ম্যাসাকারটা হয়েছে, ওইটার শিক্ষা কে দিচ্ছে আমাদেরকে? আমরা কি, এটা তো ইউরোপে হয়েছে, এটা কি আমরা শিখছি নাকি? 1945, is that the correct date? যে when did World War II end?
1945. 1939 to 1945.
1939 to 1945, the war ended, and alhamdulillah today students get to learn about the Holocaust and what happened. But what happened in Bosnia is in 1995.
Yes.
It's very recent.
Yeah.
And আপনারা যেটা বলছেন, from what I'm hearing, there is so many similarities that just like the Jews had to wear an arm badge to identify that they're Jews, Muslims had to wear an arm badge that said that they're Muslims. And their businesses were known, you couldn't hide Muslims, and it was an open attack on them. And just like the Jewish community lost many members of their generations, এখানে আমাদের same situation হচ্ছে with the Bosnian Muslim community. আর এটা কি আমাদের স্কুল সিস্টেমে, আমি তো এটা খুব ভালো করে আমি নিজেই জানতাম না। আমি জানি না যে আপনারা ঘরে এটা কোনো সময় ভালো করে শিখেছেন, আপনাদের বাচ্চা কাচ্চা কি স্কুলে থেকে কোনো সময় এসে বলেছেন যে ও আজকে আমরা বসনিয়ান জেনোসাইডের উপরে শিক্ষা পেয়েছি? সবাই জানে যে অ্যাডলফ হিটলার ইজ আ ব্যাড গাই, কিন্তু বসনিয়ান জেনোসাইডের যে এই অ্যাট্রসিটিস কে করেছে ওইটার নাম কি আমরা জানি? নো। কেন জানি না? আমরা এই শিক্ষাটা কেন পাচ্ছি না? এরা তো ইউরোপিয়ানস, দিস হ্যাপেন্ড ইন ইউরোপ। এটা এমন না যে এটা একটা কোন দূর জায়গা থেকে হয়েছে, না, এটা ইউরোপে হয়েছে। এটা এমন না যে এটা hundreds and hundreds of years ago হয়েছে, no, it happened in 1995. So why is it that students, whether they're Christian, atheist, Muslim, are not learning about this atrocity that happened in Europe? What do you think?
I mean, having studied history at GCSE and at A-level and inshallah at university, it's clear that the whole curriculum is very, very whitewashed in terms of what we're learning. What kids are learning and why kids are not wanting to study history further is because they're learning Henry VIII had 6 wives. They're learning that World War I happened, World War II happened, and they were both bad. They're learning about maybe the Tudors. They're learning about maybe Queen Elizabeth. They're learning possibly about the Battle of Hastings in 1066. That's all European history. But as well as that, Bosnia is European history. So when we look at it, why is Bosnian history not taught? It's purely based on the fact that realistically, it's because it's a Muslim nation, and it does not fit in with the sort of whitewashed version of Europe that Europe was always a beautiful place to live in. We don't even learn about the Dark Ages. While the Dark Ages was happening, what was happening in the Islamic world? It was the golden age of Islam. While the Dark Ages were happening, there was no streetlights in Europe, but there was the streetlights in Spain, which was illuminated by Islam. Those types of history isn't taught, and because it destroys the image of a beautiful and unified Europe and a beautiful and unified history, that's why we're not taught about the Bosnian genocide. And it's interesting that we learn about World War II. I think it's too big of a genocide to just discard. Because it's such a big war, it's too big to discard. But because Bosnia maybe is in the Balkans, people discard it. When the World War I it started in Sarajevo, you learn World War I started in Sarajevo, but you don't know about the massacre that happened in Sarajevo just 30 years ago.
Why not?
Because it harms the image that people want to promote, that Europe wants to promote over it's a whitewashed history that we are getting taught.
Why is it that the history of the Holocaust is applicable because that doesn't show a united Europe then?
Yeah, I said that, as I said, it's such a big atrocity that it cannot be ignored. And because it happened in Germany, it happened in World War II. World War II has to be taught. But whereas this, I think it became such a big shock. And even if you look at the time of it happening, Europe ignored it at the time. So why are they not going to ignore it in its history curriculum? Europe completely ignored it the entire time it was happening. People knew what was happening in Bosnia. There was in newspapers. If you look at the newspapers in the 1990s, it was all over the newspapers. but there was nothing. There was no support from Britain. There was no support from Germany. There was no support from any of these nations. There was an interesting documentary, Discovering Allah in Europe, which was made by a Belgian television company, where they went to Srebrenica, they went to Bosnia. I think this was made 2018, 2014, 2010s. And they even asked the question, I don't even know, the Belgian man who was a historian, he said, I didn't even know about the massacre in Bosnia until recently.
Can I thank you, but can I ask you, because I can see that you're nodding along to this, and I know that you're part of an institution which is Darul Ummah, and it is Islamic education school institution. Do you teach what happened in Bosnia as part of the curriculum at Darul Ummah?
I can't say specifically. I'm sure it is taught in the as part of the history as an Islamic institution. And I'm talking about Jamaatul Ummah, which is part of Darul Islam, based in Bigland Street. So it will be taught as part of that history, if you like, certainly from Islamic perspective. I think the reason why I was nodding was because it doesn't necessarily fit, the image doesn't necessarily fit with the European sort of image of toleration. Yeah. And as this brother Mehdi has mentioned, I'm not sure it will necessarily get into the national curriculum in terms of, it should do, as you say, because of what's happened, where it's happened, and how recently it's happened. But I'm not sure necessarily that's going to happen anytime soon. But I think for us, as Muslims, non-Muslims, as wider community, because it's not, I mean, the way I look at it is, it's a issue that affects the humanity. Yeah, that was Muslims that were massacred. It could be Christians, could be Jewish, could be Hindus, could be any sort of religion or sect. And there is, from an Islamic perspective, there is no place for hatred and a genocide and what's happened in that respect. So we should raise awareness, which is what Islam Channel is doing, alhamdulillah, and various other sort of Islamic institutions and news mediums. The other thing I think is quite important, you know, in Bosnia they have this 3-day march, again, memorial to sort of remember the genocide, and that's quite important on an annual basis because it has to be sort of remembered so it never happens again.
Absolutely.
So I think all of those things are quite important, and obviously we have to work with raising that awareness. I mean, the interesting thing I would say is people are opening up to finding out more about Islam, Muslims, what we do. And our doors, whether it's a masjid or an Islamic institution, we are becoming more open, and rightly so. And I'll give you a sort of example from a recent visit, the last visit that I did. I only came back last week. When I was in Split, I attended one of the masjid, did my Zuhur prayer, and I was leaving the masjid. And it was right in the center of the sort of tourist area, the masjid, alhamdulillah. And there are people just going in, non-Muslims going in just to find out. And there was this one woman who wasn't sure whether to go in or not. And there was a brother inside encouraging, and I just said to her, look, if you want to find out more, just go. And the important thing about that particular masjid is the forecourt was set up with all the Islamic literature. So when they did go in, they were welcomed, and they had the literature to take away from them to learn about Islam. And that is quite important for us to do, because some of the issues and the challenges that we've got is because people don't understand Islam or understand what we do as Muslims. So the more open we are and welcoming we are, the better it is for us to raise that awareness.
Very, very important. Very, very important. And before we go to our next clip, which will give us a little bit more about what happened in Bosnia. Just to summarize, I think the main question and the main points that both our guests have raised is that in our schools today, we are taught about the Holocaust that happened from 1939 to 1945. And it happened in Europe, and it was a tragedy. But there are questions for why the tragedy that happened in Bosnia in 1995, and it was a genocide, is not taught. And that is a unique question that should be answered, because it happened in Europe and it happened to Muslims, but it could have been Christians, it could have been Jews, it could have been atheists.
Can I just
Yeah.
just for 1 second, because I know you want to go to the clip, is that people underestimate the fact that Bosnia was still Muslim and Christians. It's virtually completely divided between Muslims and Christians who live in harmony, who lived in harmony for hundreds of years under the Ottoman rule. So even as much as we're saying it's a Muslim genocide, Muslims are mainly the target, but Christians were also killed. Muslims and Christians even defended their Muslim brothers and sisters in Bosnia because they lived in harmony, they lived in peace, and it wasn't the case of just Christians killing Muslims. It was the case of one state completely terrorizing and destroying another state and saving a few of the people handpicked. Mm-hmm. And I would like to say, before you switch, I know you're eager to switch to the video, is that I think there is starting to be change, because from when I was leaving my school, is that I was working with a lot of the history teachers to start changing the curriculum. From my school, when I was in year 8, we learned maybe a bit about slavery being okay, maybe the British wasn't too involved in it. Now they were learning about Mansa Musa, the richest man ever to exist. They started learning about the Arab Spring. They started learning about recent history.
Is that as part of the GCSE curriculum or stopping at year 9?
Year 7, year 8, year 9. And GCSE curriculum we cannot change because that's a national curriculum. But if we're just to make small changes within our own community, for example, my school, I was able to start changing with the help of many teachers who are open-minded. Year 7, year 8, year 9, that's when people start thinking about history. That's when people start making their thoughts. When you're at a young, impressionable age, that's when you start making changes. Okay, this happened, or this happened, this happened. You start connecting the dots. So if they're teaching, now they started to teach Islamic history, and they started to teach about Arab Spring. Of course, I spoke about the Bosnian genocide happening and why it should be taught. And they started putting it into some year 8 lessons. I even taught a year 7 lesson about the Bosnian genocide. So these sort of events that happened, if we're just to help our small community, the national curriculum will come along eventually. But if we're just to focus on the year 7, year 8, year 9, even the primary school kids who are going to learn history, we want to teach them that this is the reality of the case, as opposed to just small hand-picked stories of beauty or of tragedy. Mm-hmm. To teach everything, to keep an open mind, that's the best way to teach kids going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So if we are ready to go forward with the clip now, if you just watch it very shortly and then come back and join us, inshallah.
ওসমানীয় খেলাফতের সম্প্রসারণের মধ্য দিয়ে 1400 শতকে ইসলাম প্রথমবার বলকান অঞ্চলে প্রবেশ করে। বসনিয়ায় ইসলাম তুলনামূলকভাবে দ্রুত ছড়িয়ে পড়ে এবং স্বভাবতই প্রচুর মসজিদ তৈরি করা হয়, যার বেশিরভাগই এখনো দাঁড়িয়ে আছে এবং আজও তা ব্যবহৃত হচ্ছে। বসনিয়া ছিল অটোমান জ্যানিসারি কর্পস, যারা অটোমান সেনাবাহিনী ও প্রশাসনের একটি উল্লেখযোগ্য অংশের প্রতিনিধিত্ব করত। ওসমানী শিক্ষা ব্যবস্থার আদলে 3 ধরনের ইসলামী শিক্ষা ব্যবস্থা প্রতিষ্ঠা করা হয়েছিল: মক্তব, মুয়াল্লিমখানা, কিশোরদের মাদ্রাসা এবং মাদ্রাসা। মজার বিষয় হলো, এখানে ব্যবহৃত পাঠ্যক্রমটি সেলজুক এবং ইসলামিক পণ্ডিত নিজামুল মুলক দ্বারা তৈরি করা পাঠ্যক্রমের অনুরূপ ছিল, যা ইসলামের মূল বিষয়গুলি এবং মৌলিক বিষয়গুলি শেখানো হতো। যুগোস্লাভিয়ার প্রতিষ্ঠা এবং কমিউনিস্ট মতাদর্শ জীবন থেকে ধর্মকে সরিয়ে দেওয়ার প্রচেষ্টার কারণে 1900 শতকে এই অঞ্চলে ইসলামী শিক্ষা বেশ বিপর্যয়ের মুখে পড়েছিল। তবে অনেক বসনিয়ানদের জন্য রাজনীতি এবং ব্যক্তিগত জীবনে ইসলাম বরাবরই একটি শক্তিশালী মাধ্যম হিসেবে বিবেচিত হয়ে আসছে। যুগোস্লাভিয়ার বিভাজন এবং রাষ্ট্রপতি আলিজা ইজেটবেগোভিচের নিয়োগের পর ইসলামী শিক্ষার পুনরুজ্জীবন দেখা যায়, কিন্তু সার্বদের নৃশংসতার ফলে 1996 সাল পর্যন্ত ইসলামী শিক্ষা ব্যবস্থার বড় কোনো সংস্কার বাস্তবায়ন করা কঠিন ছিল। এই ধরনের যুদ্ধের পর অনেক লোক তাদের ধর্মীয় বিশ্বাসে আরও দৃঢ় হয়ে ওঠে। বসনিয়াতে এর ব্যতিক্রম হয়নি। সংখ্যাগরিষ্ঠ মুসলিম জনগোষ্ঠী দেশটির বিভিন্ন স্কুলে ইসলাম শিখাচ্ছেন। বসনিয়াতে ইসলাম বিস্তারের সাথে সাথে ইসলাম শিক্ষারও চাহিদা বেড়েছে। প্রতিনিয়তই নতুন নতুন মক্তব চালু করার অনুরোধ আসছে।
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome back. And আমরা এখন একটুখানি ডিসকাস করব যে যে বসনিয়ার যে এই ট্র্যাজেডিটা হয়েছে, এখান থেকে আমরা আমাদের নিজের জীবনের ভিতরে আমরা যদি দেখি যে একটা পুরা জেনারেশন কিন্তু ডিলিটেড হয়ে গেছে ফ্রম এ কমিউনিটি। যে এখান থেকে যে চিন্তা করেন যে আপনার লাইফের ভিতরে আপনি নোটিস করেছেন যে আপনার মা বাপ, আঙ্কেলস, বড় যা আমাদের মুরব্বী, সব মুরব্বীকে কিন্তু কয়েক বছরের ভিতরে একদম ডিলিট হয়ে গেছে। এইটাই হচ্ছে অ্যাকচুয়াল ফ্যাক্টস যেটা বসনিয়া হয়েছে। ওদের মুরব্বীদেরকে ওরা ডিলিট করে দিয়েছে। যেটা মেহেদি ভাই বলছে যে ওরা এমন একটা করছিল যে বাচ্চা বাচ্চা ছেলেদেরকে ওদের বন্ধুদেরকে মারতে হয়েছে। আর তারপরে একবার ওকে যখন মেরে ফেলেছে, আরেকটা বন্ধুকে ওর কবরটাকে ডিগ করে ফেলতে হয়েছে ওটার ভিতরে। এটা হচ্ছে একটা ডিপ লেভেল অফ টর্চার যেটা একটা মানুষকে কিন্তু পুরো লাইফে এফেক্ট করবে। যে আপনারা যদি চিন্তা করেন, এটা এমন যে দুইটা ভাইকে বলছে এক ভাইটাকে আরেকটা ভাইটাকে মারতে হবে, আর এক মাকে বলতে হচ্ছে যে তুমি তোমার বাচ্চাকে তুমি মেরে ফেলো। আর তোমার যদি দুইটা বাচ্চা আছে, একটাকে চুজ করো, একটা মরতে হবে, তুমি কোনটা মারতে চাও তুমি চুজ করো। আর আপনার হাজব্যান্ড ওয়াইফকে, তোমার ওয়াইফকে এখন এখানে যেতে হবে এই সোলজারদের সাথে। এরকম একটা অ্যাট্রসিটি, একটা সাইকোলজিক্যাল অ্যাবিউজ, এটা কিন্তু কল্পনা করা খুবই কঠিন আমার জন্য। আর এটা থেকে যে কীভাবে বসনিয়া বের হয়েছে আমি জানি না। তো এটা আমার গেস্টদেরকে আমি দিচ্ছি যে হাউ ডিড বসনিয়া কাম আউট ফ্রম সাচ অ্যান ইভিল সিচুয়েশন?
I think if we look at Bosnia, when they had no baba, no nana, the small babies that are born recently, they have no nana because their granddad died during the war or had been killed, and they have that story. If I'm honest, if you look at the history of it, recently in the 1990s when the whole genocide happened, people looked to Izet Begovic, who I said before was the president of Bosnia at the time. He was known as the Baba, he was known as the father of the nation. He obviously set up many orphanages and those areas, but he was seen as the person who took Bosnia, a struggling nation, and carried them out of war. And when he died, so many people from different countries, thousands of people came to his janazah because of how big of a person how big of a character he was. And this country mourned as if they had lost the whole country mourned as if they had lost their own dad, because that's how much of a figure he was. And he was the person who was able to carry Bosnia. And I think he is someone who has to be commemorated as well also, in terms of when we're looking at Bosnia, we're looking at all these issues that happened. The one person who was able to try and help solve these issues, who held on desperately with Islam in his heart, is Izet Begovic. And we have to view him as very crucial to this massacre.
Absolutely. আপনার কি মনে হয় এই ম্যাটার উপর?
I think important ব্যাপার হচ্ছে তারা যে you can't imagine is a suffering person তারা mentally I'm sure they'll be disturbed for many years to come.
100%.
The greatest lesson for them and for us is the Islam's সাথে যে একটা বন্ডিশ হওয়াটা, that was quite important. I think that gives them peace as well. কারণ ultimately আমরা তো মুসলমান হিসেবে মনে করি যে আমরা দুনিয়াতে এসেছি, there's a purpose, and of course there is a purpose. আল্লাহ যে ফরিকাত ফলাইছেন যে শাস্তি মানে the martyrdom that they went through has waken up the community in that respect. So প্রত্যেকটা খারাপ জিনিস পরে বালাই আয়. So what I think একটা হইছে ফায়দা যে একটা হইছে, obviously they're traumatized, and even when I spoke to my friend a couple of nights ago, I haven't really discussed in much detail. One, I don't know him very close because of the recent relationship, but I could sense in his, so when after he mentioned about the money, his father died, his uncle died, এরপরে দাদা দাদিয়ারা মারা গেছে. He couldn't really talk properly. I can sense it, and I didn't really progress the discussion further. So
it's still emotional.
It's still emotional. And how can you forget something like that? Afnar Amajid Marazain Soy Mashake.
But it's a very horrific way.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very, accept horror is very difficult. But I think this is my personal feeling, they've turned to Islam as a result, and that has given them inner peace. Because ultimately they are shaheed, Allah will grant them Jannah. And they've been searching, why has it happened? I think that's the key thing, really. And
it's a big question.
The more and more people are turning as a result to Islam, which is the most positive thing. Now, but nothing will sort of bring them back, change the circumstances. But inner peace, because of when you have total trust in Allah, then it gives you a sense of peace, which nothing else can give. This is my personal feeling and belief, and I strongly believe in that. So, but I think as a community, আমরা একটা important একটা খরা একটু লগে দেন কিভাবে আমরা এই জিনিসটা রিমেম্বার করতে পারি, যাতে করে ভবিষ্যতে আমরা একটা থেকে শিক্ষা নিতে পারি। And আমরার বাইন যারা বইনিন যারা abroad আছে Muslim, that's the unity of the Muslim Ummah, বুঝতে পারছেন। And I will say, Bosnia যে ঘটনা হয়েছে, it could happen anywhere. It could even be in the UK in 50, 100, 200 years time. And the reason I say that is because, and I'll give you another example in terms of why education and engagement is important. Because education gives you power. It gives you a sense of understanding of what's happened and what you need to do for the future. So Darul Ummah Red Bridge, and I get to mention that every so often.
Sorry, just I have to pause you at this point because our time is very limited. But I just want to quickly wrap up, and I think a very important point is that just like we get tested day to day in our lives, the purpose of these tests at a micro level is to accept that Allah is all-powerful and to submit to His will, and that's how we achieve peace. And for Bosnia as a nation have had to submit to Allah's power and accept that this happened to our nation, and through that they are also achieving peace. And I think that's a very important message from you. And I think just as a final comment, I'll pass over to both of you, inshallah. For final comments, we have just a few seconds left.
Just to say is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَإِنَّمَا الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّمَا الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا. With every hardship comes ease. So now, alhamdulillah, as you were saying, Bosnians have found that inner peace. And it's something that you were saying is how do people deal with it? When we were watching a documentary, they were crying. When I was there, people were crying when they were watching the documentary of the Serbian soldiers. So it's still very real. It's still a huge pain.
Yes.
But the fact that they're holding onto that pain as a form of iman, they know that their parents are going to Jannah. They know. So they're holding on to that. Even some were saying, I wish that they would take me as a martyr. They would fight for that strength. That you see the strength of iman coming through. When there's hardships, you see where you really lie, So alhamdulillah, Bosnia has come out on the other side.
And that's unfortunately all we have time for today. And inshallah, what we will do is we'll continue for the Muslim Education Show next week. And inshallah, we hope that you will return and we'll be able to discuss this further with you. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.